Today, as our message, we're in the middle of a series on 1 Peter, and it's called Sojourners, Living in a World That's Not Our Own. And Peter, as he's writing this letter, he's giving us some instructions on how to live in a world that's temporary, to live in a world that is troublesome, to live in a world that is burdensome, but to keep our eyes focused on that which is not temporary, but that which is eternal. And today we're going to be continuing this message with our sermon this morning. The title is, it's not advancing here, guys. You got it for me? There we go. Is entitled Simply Focus. And I really want us to think about that for a minute. We as believers need to have a singular focus. And that's what Peter is going to drive home today in our text. We're going to be looking in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. Now, before we get into this, I want you to understand that there's a little bit of context that you need to understand. First of all, this letter was written around somewhere between 62 and 63 A.D. So about 30 years after Christ had ascended into heaven. It was written while Nero was emperor of Rome. Now understand something, that at this point, Nero had not burned Rome. And we'll get into that a little bit later. There's a history behind, when Peter was writing this letter, history was taking place, and Peter wasn't really aware of the history that was to come. But just a couple of years later, let me tell you what these words that Peter wrote certainly were a challenge for himself. And Peter, when he wrote these words, he was writing to Jewish exiles that are in what is today currently Turkey. Back then it was known as Asia Minor. And these exiles had been driven out of Israel. They were Christians, they were Jews, they'd been driven in to live with the Gentiles. And that was a challenge, because to be a Christian and living in a pagan Gentile culture meant you were going to find it very hard to just even go buy food for your family. Because when you went into the marketplace, the first thing you had to do is you had to pay tribute to a pagan god. If you didn't do that, you couldn't buy or sell. So life for these Christians in these Roman pagan cultures was very challenging. And not only that, but they were also looked down upon. Peter grew up under Roman military occupation. The Romans hated the Jews. They considered them dogs. They considered them scum. And they treated them as such. And so what Peter had experienced his entire life was that the government that he was living under was oppressive, and it was something that he hated. So the words that we're going to read today that were written by Peter were not words that were easily written by Peter. Something changed in Peter's life that allowed him to pen these words, even though his experience in his life at that point was anything that would seem to align with these words. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. Oh, before we do that, before we read, I want you to understand we're going to fill in some blanks today. We're going to look at we're going to break this passage down into 3 sections, and we're going to fill in these blanks, but when we're done, we're going to have one truth that we can walk away here today and apply to our lives, okay? So here we go. Let's get into the Word. Beginning in verse 13, it says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution." Now let me stop there. When Peter starts this part of 1 Peter, and he's into this part of the letter, he starts identifying certain institutions that we are to be subject for the Lord's sake. The government, work, and family. Next week, we're covering family. Today, we're covering the first two. We're covering government and basically our employment. He says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil, and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorant of foolish people. Now drop down to verse 18. Servants, and he's talking about employment now. Servants, employees, be subject to your masters, your bosses, your managers, with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. So as we take a look at this passage, Peter is beginning to tell us that we need to be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Peter is emphasizing here something that we need to always keep in mind. That our actions as believers and followers of Jesus Christ, that our actions are a reflection of the God we serve. Let me say that again. Our actions, our words, our deeds are a reflection of the God that we serve. How too often in our day-to-day, the only thing that we hear about Christians is about the ones who don't give a good reflection of our God. If we were to hold to this idea that our actions for the Lord's sake, that we should always keep in mind that it speaks for our God, for our Christ, the Messiah that we follow. We need to understand that in our life, in our experiences, there is always a higher purpose. All too often, we become myopic to our life. This is my situation. This is my experience. This is what's happening to me. But what Peter is saying is, take off the blinders. Understand that there is a higher purpose. There is a grander plan at work around you. And understand that you are not forgotten. That God is at work in the experiences that you are going through. Paul wrote about this in Romans chapter 13. And he wrote almost the same words as Peter, but he did it about 10 years before. And look at what he says. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Let every person be subject to bring them. That word to be subject literally means to bring yourself into submission. It applies to your free will. It invokes your free will and says, let every person bring themselves into submission to the governing authorities. For there is no authority, look what he says, there is no authority except from God. Every 4 years we have an election, and half the people are upset and half of the people are happy. As believers, we should always be happy. And let me say this. Understand where I'm coming from on this. I have a Master's of Arts degree in political management. I served on Capitol Hill for 6 years. I was a chief of staff to 2 different members of Congress. I have run for political office. I have raised nearly $1 million for political candidates. I'm not saying this to brag. I'm just telling you my context as it applies to this. But let me tell you, so if God is speaking to anybody today, He's speaking to me. I've invested my life in our government. And every day I get up and I fight for our military families. That's my job. Right now, I'm drafting legislation to help improve the quality of life for our military families in hope that it'll get passed this year. So I deal with these individuals on a very individual basis. I know the politicians. I've sat in their offices, I've sat around tables with them, and I've talked to them. I know them personally. But what I want us to understand today, and what Peter is trying to help us understand here, what Paul is trying to give us to understand, they are there because God put them there. And when God puts somebody in a place, we as believers, whether we agree with their policies or not, need to glorify God. Because His plans are higher than our plans. His ways are higher than our ways. There is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists these authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive His approval, for He is God's servant for your good. As believers living in a culture today, where if you maybe say something that doesn't align, you can be canceled. Guess what? Jesus told us we would live in a world that would cause us trouble. He never said this was going to be easy. And while we as Christians living in our country have been tremendously blessed, we clearly are coming under persecution. In every institution. Whether it's at our place of employment, it's with the government, it's within our homes, it's within the schools that our kids attend. Every institution, everywhere we go, we will find challenge to what we believe as followers of Jesus. But do not fret. That's what Peter is saying here. He goes on. Go back to Peter. He says, look, for this is the will of God. God has a plan. And God is working out His perfect plan. And we need to stay focused on His plan and what He is up to in our world. So what is the point we need to walk away with? Number one, God is in control. When you don't like the president, guess what? God is still in control. When Congress passes a law that you don't agree with, guess what? God is still in control. When the Supreme Court rules in a way that you disagree, guess what? God is still in control. You see, our hope is not in the school board. Our hope is not in the board of supervisors. And we have Janine Lawson, who's one of our supervisors here with us. She's a member of this church. And she fights the good fight for us every day. But our hope is not in that institution. Our hope is not in the General Assembly, it's not in our governor, it's not in our Congress, and it's not in our president or the Supreme Court. Our hope is in God, the one who has established each and every single one of them. And understand that my God is too wise to make a mistake. And that my God is too good to do wrong. And because of that, my God is trustworthy. Is that your God? Is your God too good to do wrong? Is your God too wise to mistake? And is your God trustworthy? If He is, then we will not fret. But rather, we will be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution. And whether it be with government or with our employment, we'll remember that God has placed us here and now, and He has brought every person into our life that He desires to bring for us to have an impact on them. That God has a plan. Now let's move on to the second point. He says in verse 16, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Believe me, those words were not easy for Peter to write. as it relates to our employment. He says, "For this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God." Now, I don't know if they still have beatings where you work. Maybe they have signs that say the beatings will continue till morale improves. I don't know. I don't think we've got it as bad as what some people may have had in the past in terms of our employment. But I know that there are times, and remember, so Peter's writing in an era where servanthood, bondservants, slavery was part of their culture, and it was a slavery that was built upon indebtedness. If you owed somebody money, you became a bondservant to them. And so, understand that the principles still apply to us in the way that we work. When we make a contract with somebody that we're going to perform a deed, or perform a service for someone, we are basically becoming a bondservant to them. And they're going to pay us. We're not indebted to them. They don't keep the money. They pay us and we pay our debts back, hopefully. But in these institutions, Peter is telling us to live as people who are free and not using our freedom as a cover-up for evil. Up in the earlier verses 11 and 12, he kind of sets the tone here. He says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners," there's our word there, "and exiles," remember the exiles that are in Asia Minor, "to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation," or when He returns. You see, what Peter is saying is, don't give them a reason to do evil against you. Always do good. Always set the example. Never give them the evidence that they need to say that you are a bad person. Only give them good. Why? Because as what Peter says there, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God. That maybe by your good deeds, their hearts will turn. So as we live in this culture and we live in this world today, it is up to us to live a good life and to live in a way that honors and glorifies God. But it also means, as the psalmist wrote in Proverbs 25, he said, "Look, if your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. For you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you." I remember one time when we were living in Alaska and there were some issues before the state legislature, and I went to testify in support of a couple of those bills. Well, the people who were on the other side, man, they just really started hating me when I would go testify. And then one day, one of them made a false accusation against me in their testimony. And it was actually a member of the legislature who didn't agree with me, who actually called them out and said, "Wait a minute, he never did that. He never said that." By being honorable, by doing good, and focusing on the positive, I was able to sway even those people who disagreed with me. And even then, they knew that I wasn't there to attack people, but that I was there to support a principle and a truth that I believed in. But I could do it in a way that did not disparage other people. As believers, we may disagree with people. It doesn't make us have to be disagreeable. We can still show kindness and compassion to those people that with whom we disagree. Now, the other side may not do that. They may try to cancel you. They may try to quiet you. They may try to shut you up. But guess what? We don't repay evil with evil. Because we reflect God. And we serve Him. And we show others the character of the God we serve. As we look on down in this passage here, this word, he says, but if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing. This word literally means credit. It becomes credit for you. And what this credit does, it means is that God will reward you because of your suffering. And always remember this. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous and His ears toward their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So even in the midst of your troubles, and even in the midst of when you're being attacked, even in the midst of when your life, when you are suffering, God has not left you. He has not forgotten about you. He's there. He's listening. And He will take care of you. So, second point, God is in control, so do good. If God is in control of everything that's happening, we should not fear. We should recognize the power of God in our life, the power of God in the world, and recognize that He is at work accomplishing His plans. So our focus should be on obeying Him and doing good. But that's not it. That's not all. Let's keep going. He goes on to say, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in His steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in His mouth. When He was reviled, He did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten, but continued entrusting Himself to Him who judges justly. He Himself bore our sins in His body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By His wounds you have been healed. For you are straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So what is Peter trying to teach us here? Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example. There's a hymn that says, turn your eyes upon Jesus. No matter how bad this world gets, no matter how mistreated you are, think about the suffering of Christ. Christ never committed a sin. He never did any wrong, and yet He suffered greatly. Why? For you. He loved you. And so He went to a cross, and He died upon that cross to pay for your sins and my sins, so that we could live eternally with Him. And that's the message that your kids have learned this week. That when it's all said and done, no matter what happens in this world, it's all about Jesus and what He has done for us upon that cross. That He saves us. This world may provide us trouble, but there's an eternity coming where there is no more suffering, there is no more pain. And the government will always be just. Because our King is Jesus. So what did Peter do? In the midst of challenging them related to the institutions where they were having some challenges, he said very simply, stay true to the gospel. God is in control, so do good and stay focused on the gospel. You know, as believers, we can become distracted by so many things. I was actually, I didn't realize the kids were going to leave today, so I actually had a second little message for them based on Thomas the Tank Engine. And one of the things that the overseer of the railway, y'all know who he is? Who is it? Sir Topham Hatt, that's right. So good old Sir Topham Hatt, the overseer of the railway. He wanted his engines to do one thing. You know what it was? Be really useful engines. But when they weren't, when they became distracted on things that they weren't supposed to be doing, he says he would always start out each day. He would say, I have a very important job for you today, Thomas. But yet somehow Thomas always found something else to distract him. And so Sir Topham Hatt would always utter the words, what? You have caused confusion and delay. That's right. Thomas, you had one job, but you couldn't do it. You got distracted. Man, as believers, we become so distracted. We become so distracted by so many things. And it's a ploy from the evil one, and I'll dare say the biggest ploy that's distracting the church today is politics. I wish the church was as passionate about the gospel as it is about who's the president and who's the Speaker of the House. Imagine a church fully alive, fully focused on the gospel, whose passion was driven towards seeing this world changed and on fire for Him. What difference that could make. And yet we spend most of our time watching Fox News or MSNBC, getting riled up and angry. And guess what? That's on purpose. That's on purpose. The media's intent is to make you angry. Tom Brokaw's regret, he says, news media today has become 24/7 rage. And yet, we fall into the trap every day. And we become impassioned. And yet, it's those passions that lead us and distract us from what's most important, and that's the gospel. And all this stuff that's happening around us, we need to stay focused. Keep our eyes on Jesus, and keep our eyes on the prize to which He has called us, heavenward. And this week, our kids, they learned about all of this. And it really comes down to two words that they learned. Where's Engineer? Angie, come here. Calling an audible. It comes down to two words. Trust Jesus. Just trust Jesus. He's got it under control. There's no need to fear. So let's stand, and will you please lead us in Trust Jesus.
We trust in you, Jesus. You're all that we need. Your power will pull us through. We're trusting in you. We're trusting in you. You give us hope and life that's forever. You make us bold and we stand together. Your power will pull us through. We're trusting in you. We're trusting in you. We're off on this journey, there's no looking back. With Jesus to lead us, we're on the right track. Oh, 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 oh. Wide open spaces for wide open eyes. We're looking ahead for the next big surprise. Oh, 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 oh. We trust in you, Jesus. You're all that we need. Your power will pull us through. We're trusting in you. We're trusting in you. You give us hope and life that's forever. You make us whole and we stand together. Your power will pull us through. We're trusting in you. We're trusting in you. We're off on this journey, there's no looking back. With Jesus to lead us, we're on the right This is for wide open eyes. We're looking ahead for the next big surprise. Oh, 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 oh. We trust in you, Jesus. You're all that we need. Your power will pull us through. We're trusting in you. We're trusting in you. You give us hope and life that's forever. We stand together. Your power will pull us through. We're trusting in you. Trusting in you. Your power will pull us through. We're trusting in you. Trusting in you. Trusting in you. We're trusting in you. Trusting in you.
All right, go ahead and be seated. I want to close the loop. I started off with the context, the history. 62, 63 AD, Peter wrote these words. The very next year, Nero burned Rome. And guess who he blamed? Christians. Christians became persecuted. Nero built what's called the Circus of Nero. And that's where they would take Christians and throw them in with animals, wild animals, and then have them killed and destroyed. It's actually at the Circus of Nero where Paul and Peter both were beheaded. Today, the Circus of Nero doesn't exist. Do you know what's there? St. Peter's Basilica. Understand, the gospel always wins. Matt?